Hello, and welcome to Informa Pharma Intelligence's webinar, HIV Market Overview, Uptake of New, Safer, and Simplified Regimens to Drive HIV Market Growth. I'm Joe Haas, a senior writer with Script and the Pink Sheet, and I'm joined today by...
Hello everybody, my name is Michael Haydock. I'm a Therapeutic Area Director for Infectious Diseases and also Cardiovascular and Metabolic Diseases at Datamonitor Healthcare.
Thanks, Michael. So before we begin, I'd like to let everyone who is listening in know that this webinar is being recorded, and everyone participating will receive a copy of the recording. Also, you are welcome to send in questions at any time. There's a form at the bottom of your screen for submitting your questions. If we have time at the end of the presentation, we'll try to answer some of your questions, but we'll also respond to every question received after the webinar is concluded. In addition, for people listening to a recorded version of this webinar, we will be providing an email address where you can submit questions at the end of the presentation, and again, we'll respond to those as soon as possible. Now, I'd like to review the agenda for today's presentation. First, we will provide an overview of HIV, including a look at epidemiological trends in the disease. Then, we will overview the current market landscape, taking a look at the treatment paradigm and also review how updated treatment guidelines in both the US and Europe will affect market dynamics. Next, we will review the R&D pipeline in HIV. We'll look at what the key unmet needs are in HIV therapy, overview the developmental pipeline as Informa's BioMedTracker database follows it, and discuss how biopharmaceutical companies are attempting to address unmet needs. We'll also look at future market trends and company dynamics in HIV. We'll review both the key drivers and key hindrances to HIV market growth in the United States and the 5 largest EU nations, the UK, Germany, France, Spain, and Italy. Finally, we'll address the potential impact of generic erosion as today's top-selling branded HIV drugs face patent expiration. Factors here will include how comfortable physicians are with replacing branded single tablet regimens with multiple pill generic regimens, as well as whether doctors think that the lower costs offered by generics justify higher pill burden and the effect this might have on patient compliance with therapy. Now, I'd like to turn it over to Michael so he can discuss current and future epidemiological trends in HIV, along with disease prevalence in the United States and the EU. Michael?
Thanks very much, Joe, and hello again, everybody. So first, by way of introduction, I thought it would be quite helpful to provide a sense of perspective with regard to the current scale of the HIV disease burden and also how it's expected to change over the next decade. So to do that, I've gathered some of the epidemiology information within Datamonitor Healthcare to show you. So our in-house epidemiology team has forecast over the next 20 years the prevalence and also the incidence of HIV infection. And as you can see from the graph, prevalence is expected to remain broadly flat in the EU, but there are some rises in the US. So if I just go into a bit more detail over the next 10 years, you can see that the total prevalence of infection in the US and the 5 EU being France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK, is expected to rise just shy of 5%, so approximately 100,000 case total rise there over the next 10 years. And that rise in prevalence is largely driven by a mixture of population increases and also aging population. So it's not expected to be derived from an actual increasing proportion of the population who are infected. So if you look at the US, you can see there's approximately 1.1 million prevalent cases estimated this year. By far the largest market, actually you can see quite easily much larger than the 5 EU combined. And it's expected to undergo the greatest increase, and that's, as I said, largely just because of population growth in that market. The population of that country in particular is expected to grow most rapidly. The EU markets, you can also see, are a lot flatter. There's going to be some increases in France and also the UK, but that will be offset by declines in Germany and Italy. And in point of demographics, that's actually quite interesting, is that the HIV population is aging, and that is particularly pertinent in the case of HIV, particularly for Gilead's portfolio, which we'll come on to a bit later. But as the HIV population ages, given that there are natural declines in renal function in elderly patients and also their bone mineral density, that has really brought the toxicity profiles and long-term safety of regimens in terms of their renal and bone side effects into the fore. And we'll go on a bit later as to how that's affected the current market dynamics. But that's a brief overview, Joe, of the epidemiological trends. So I'll pass back to you to run us through the current market dynamics.
Thank you, Michael. So when we look at the current treatment landscape, we see two companies, Gilead and ViiV Healthcare, cornering a sizable majority of the market at present, while three other big pharma companies, Merck, Johnson & Johnson, and Bristol Myers Squibb, are taking varying approaches in trying to compete with the leaders, or not trying anymore in the case of Bristol. Gilead is a company in transition. It largely has ended its discovery efforts in virology, encompassing two remunerative franchise areas, hepatitis C and HIV. It also competes in the hepatitis B space, although there it often has repurposed its HIV drugs to also provide hep B therapy. While Gilead shifts its primary focus toward immuno-oncology, many are wondering if it will become vulnerable to ViiV passing it as the dominant player in HIV. In the near term, Gilead is relying on new combo pills anchored by tenofovir alafenamide, known as TAF, including the recently approved combination pill Biktarvy, to solidify its number one position in this therapeutic space. But ViiV is on its heels. A joint venture of GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, and Shionogi, with GSK holding a substantial majority of the company, ViiV's visibility in HIV therapy has grown in recent years, thanks to the market performance of Tivicay and the combo pill Triumeq. More recently, ViiV's two-drug combo pill Juluca, seen as a potentially disruptive force in a space where combos featuring three or more antiretroviral agents have been the standard, obtained U.S. approval last November and is nearing approval in Europe as well. Behind those companies, Merck is struggling to maintain the relevance in treatment of its Icentris, which has posted declining revenues in recent years. Unlike Gilead and also Bristol, though, Merck continues developing new agents for HIV with its non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor doravirine under FDA review as a solo agent, and also in development as part of a three-drug combination pill. Merck also is working on a new mechanism of action in HIV with non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase translocation inhibitor MK-8591, which is in phase 1 as a monotherapy, but also is being studied in later stage development as a combination regimen with doravirine. J&J's Janssen division, meanwhile, is trying to make its existing HIV drugs, Adurant and Prazista, more relevant in the current treatment paradigm. It has partnered with both of the market-leading companies, combining its new protease inhibitor with two Gilead agents in Simtuza, now approved in Europe and awaiting approval in the United States. Meanwhile, with ViiV, Janssen is studying Adurant in a two-drug combination with the integrase inhibitor dolutegravir, known commercially as Tivicay. Bristol still has Sustiva and Rayataz on the market as components in combination therapy, but like Gilead, it recently exited discovery and early-stage development in virology. As such, in late 2015, it sold off its HIV program, including the entire scientific team, to ViiV, giving ViiV two mid-stage programs for new oral mechanisms of action, attachment inhibitors, and maturation inhibitors. More on those later, I promise. Now, moving on to the next slide, this illustrates that there are 47 drugs currently marketed for HIV in the United States, although only 14 of those agents are recommended under treatment guidelines. 13 different companies have approved HIV drugs on the market in the U.S., ranging from Gilead and ViiV with 13 apiece to Theratechnologies' monoclonal antibody product Trogarza, which got FDA approval in March. That wraps up the current treatment paradigm, and I apologize for any confusion on the slides, as I think some of what I just presented was on the previous slide. Now, Michael, when we look at the treatment guidelines for both the United States and Europe, what drives many doctors' therapeutic decisions are those treatment guidelines. Can you overview those for us, including how they've been changing recently, and also how they differ in the U.S. and Europe? Michael?
Sure, thanks, Joe. So on the left-hand side of the page here, you can see the US Department of Health and Human Services guidelines. And on the right-hand side, we've got the regional EU guidelines here produced by the European AIDS Clinical Society. So if we just focus on the US for now, you can actually see in both sets of guidelines, but particularly in the US, they're extremely favourable towards Gilead and ViiV Healthcare, and that's because they have a strong preference for INSTI-based regimens, INSTI meaning integrase strand transfer inhibitor or integrase inhibitor for short. So, and they particularly show why Gilead is so dominant in the field. So if you look at the first three regimens and then the final two on the left, so Biktarvy, Genvoya, Stribild, all of those are Gilead-owned single-tablet regimens. And then the last two regimens you can see there that contain Descovy or Truvada as the NRTI backbone. Both of those backbones are Gilead-owned, and they are the preferred backbones in guidelines. So if you think with regard to patients who are starting therapy in the last year and also in the coming years, the vast majority, if physicians are abiding by these guidelines, are going to be receiving either a partly owned or fully owned Gilead regimen. Now, the guidelines are also quite favourable towards ViiV Healthcare. So ViiV Healthcare's products here are Triamec, which contains dolutegravir alongside its NRTI backbone abacavir and lamivudine, and also Tivicay, which is the brand name for dolutegravir in that fifth regimen there. Now, dolutegravir is a particularly attractive integrase inhibitor. It's considered the gold standard integrase inhibitor at the moment, and that's because of its very strong efficacy and tolerability profile. It also has an extremely high barrier to resistance. And then finally, it doesn't require pharmacokinetic boosting, which is one of the drawbacks of Gilead's older integrase inhibitor, elbopegravir, which they very recently replaced with bictegravir. However, conversely, these guidelines are very detrimental to the portfolios of Johnson & Johnson and Bristol Myers Squibb. So Johnson & Johnson, both of those companies have protease inhibitors, so darunavir in the case of Johnson & Johnson and atazanavir in the case of Bristol Myers Squibb. And they also contain NNRTIs, so non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitors, adherence and Truvada. Now you can see in the US guidelines, darunavir was actually downgraded very recently, so the US guidelines were last updated earlier this year. And darunavir, which is Johnson & Johnson's leading protease inhibitor, has been downgraded from a recommended regimen to only recommended in certain clinical situations. Now that is effectively shorthand for patients who are either in a test and treat model, so they've been diagnosed and we want to immediately start them on treatment. So protease inhibitors are quite useful there because they have very high barriers to resistance, and so you could start treating a patient before their resistance profile is known. And they're also quite handy for patients who are suspected of having poor adherence or who are likely to have in future poor adherence. So that still has some niche use there, but certainly declining. If we go back to the EU guidelines, you can see protease inhibitor darunavir there is still recommended, so the situation is not as negative for Johnson & Johnson in the EU. And then if we look at the NNRTI options, rilpivirine you can see no longer recommended in the US guidelines, but the EU guidelines, which were last updated in October 2017, I believe, still recommend rilpivirine as a recommended agent. That said, they do note some key drawbacks. So rilpivirine has a lower barrier to resistance than protease inhibitors and also integrase inhibitors, and it also has inferior efficacy in patients with high viral loads. So with those caveats in mind, it still will play a role. However, going back to Bristol Myers Squibb, I mentioned they have Truvada. That has been downgraded for a good few years now, and that's largely because of its poor CNS tolerability. So rilpivirine is still hanging on there, but in the US we're particularly expecting its share to decline. So Joe, that's a whistle-stop tour of the treatment guidelines. So back to you.
Thanks, Michael. So given where the treatment guidelines stand today, it seems the integrase inhibitor class has taken center stage. What are some of the market dynamics across this class, and then how do some of the other established drug classes for HIV fit in, Michael?
Thanks. So, as I mentioned, integrase inhibitors are clearly dominating, and they're particularly strong drivers of ViiV Healthcare's revenues and also Gilead's revenues. So if you take a look at the 2017 reported sales, integrase inhibitor-based regimens comprise 37% of Gilead sales, and while that number may not seem too high, it is expected to increase, and it's largely diluted by the fact that Gilead also has several other regimens that are no longer recommended, regimens like Atripla, Complera, Odefsey. And if we then go back to ViiV Healthcare, you can see there their 2017 sales for their dolutegravir-containing regimens, which are Triumeq and Tivicay, have reached close to $5 billion. ViiV Healthcare has really been a thorn in Gilead's side over the last few years, and that is purely because of dolutegravir. So as I mentioned, dolutegravir has got a very favourable clinical profile. It was considered the best-in-class integrase inhibitor, which has allowed ViiV to gradually eat into Gilead's market share. Also, as a third agent, so Tivicay is marketed not only as part of Triumeq, but also as a standalone agent. So as a third agent, in addition to NNRTI backbones, Tivicay is considered superior to Isentress in terms of its resistance barrier, but also in treatment-experienced patients, it has actually shown superiority to Isentress, which is Merck & Co.'s integrase inhibitor. So Merck's franchise has been declining gradually, so you can see since Tivicay launched in 2013, its sales have declined from close to 900 million to about 565 million there. So ViiV Healthcare has gradually been eroding its share there. However, in response, Gilead isn't kind of sitting on its hands. It has recently launched Biktarvy. So Biktarvy is a combination of Gilead's TAF backbone, which is preferred by most physicians because of its superior safety profile compared to ViiV Healthcare's abacavir lamivudine. And Biktarvy contains bictegravir, which is Gilead's successor integrase inhibitor to elbictegravir. Now, bictegravir doesn't require boosting, which is the key improvement over its predecessor. But that and the fact that it has shown non-inferior efficacy to dolutegravir in itself isn't what's expected to drive its uptake. But Biktarvy is expected to allow Gilead to recoup some of its market share, and that's primarily because of the backbone. So I mentioned TAF is the preferred backbone. The reason it's preferred is because if we go back to Triumeq, which is ViiV Healthcare's product, that contains abacavir lamivudine, and the abacavir component is associated with hypersensitivity reactions for people with certain HLA-B polymorphism, and also a disputed link to myocardial infarction. So by providing physicians with a way to use the TAF backbone with an integrase inhibitor that is just as good as dolutegravir based on its pivotal data, that's been a key driver, we think, of future growth for Gilead and recouping its market share. So then if I just briefly move on to the PIs and the NNRTIs, so as I mentioned, these are losing ground, particularly in the US because of the guideline changes. If we start with Johnson & Johnson, so with darunavir expected to lose share in the first-line setting, one strategy that Johnson & Johnson has to try and maintain darunavir's relevance is they've recently launched a single-tablet regimen. It's actually the first ever protease inhibitor containing single-tablet regimen called Simtusa. So that's available in the EU, but it's currently under review by the FDA in the US. And by combining darunavir with the TAF backbone that I previously mentioned, the company is hoping to address the historical perception that protease inhibitors are less convenient, and that's because historically they had to be taken in separate pills. So as I mentioned, first ever single tablet regimen should help stem the decline, particularly in treatment experienced patients where it would be quite attractive to have just one pill rather than having to have a tailored regimen of a protease inhibitor. The same company, Johnson & Johnson, is also attempting to reposition rilpivirine. So I mentioned that's also losing relevance in US guidelines, still has a reasonable amount of share in the EU markets where it's still recommended. But its positioning really has become a bit irrelevant because it was originally launched as a more tolerable alternative to Cystiva, which is part of Atripla. But given that Atripla is no longer a recommended regimen, its place in the treatment algorithm has become a bit vague. So Johnson & Johnson is aiming to reposition it as part of two drug regimens by collaborating with ViiV Healthcare, and we'll come on to those a little bit later on. Unfortunately for Bristol Myers Squibb, Joe, you've already mentioned that they've discontinued their pipeline development in the area. Severance and atazanavir, which is its protease inhibitor, they're both in terminal decline, and that's pretty much because they're both now facing generic competition in the US. And Cystiva is also facing generic competition in the EU. And as I've mentioned, the negative guideline changes, we're expected its franchise and its involvement in the HIV field to just really gradually disappear over time, Joe.
Thanks, Michael. Now let's take a closer look at the development pipeline for HIV and how unmet needs are being addressed. What seems to be the primary need in HIV, Michael?
Yeah, so you can see from the graph here that the need for lower cost treatments is definitely the most pertinent unmet need. That's perhaps unsurprising when you consider the fact that HIV obviously has a substantial burden, as I showed in the first few slides. But once a patient is diagnosed, they're recommended to receive antiretroviral therapy for the rest of their life. So over the lifetime of a patient, that adds up into a pretty substantial economic burden, particularly when you consider in the US, for example, the leading integrase inhibitors have list prices of anywhere between $30,000 to $35,000 per year. So very substantial cost burden there. But just to back up to explain what this graph is actually showing. So we surveyed 190 infectious disease specialists across the US and the 5 EU markets, and we asked them to rate the relative importance of these unmet needs. And the way we asked them to do that was to assign 100 points across those 4 unmet needs, and in short, a higher point allocation represents a more important unmet need. So you can see all of these bars for each country will add up to 100, and consistently across all countries, with a tiny exception in Germany there, decreased cost of treatment far exceeds the other unmet needs. However, of course, it's not the only one. So there's also improved diagnosis rates, superior long-term safety, which has partly been addressed by Gilead's new TAF products with regards to renal and bone safety. And then finally, also improving adherence. So pipeline regimens, that's effectively the remit they have to try and meet. And we'll go on to the next few slides and we'll explore what's in development for those and also how they're expecting to address those unmet needs. So back to you, Joe.
Sorry about that. Thanks, Michael. When we look at the developmental pipeline overall in HIV, what do we see there?
Yeah, so looking at Biomedtracker's pipeline database here, which is on the screen, you can see that there's still huge interest in HIV, despite the fact that there are now a very wide range of very effective antiretroviral regimens. There's certainly still a lot of interest. So you can see just shy of 50 pipeline candidates here, and that's counting anything from phase 1 through to pre-registration. So perhaps unsurprisingly, GlaxoSmithKline here will represent ViiV Healthcare. It's the largest shareholder of that joint venture. So unsurprisingly, GlaxoSmithKline and Johnson & Johnson leading the way in the pipeline. Their particular focus, as I've already mentioned, is on simplified regimens. So those have a dual benefit, potentially reducing side effects and just improving the safety profile of treatment, but also reducing the cost of treatment and the key potential benefits there. You can also see Merck is very active in the pipeline, so it's got 4 agents at the moment. That you can kind of put in the context of declining sales for Icentris, its integrase inhibitor product that I mentioned earlier. So Merck & Co is developing doravirine, which you've mentioned is a new NNRTI agent, both as a standalone agent but also as a component of a low-cost single-tablet regimen. And it also has a novel reverse transcriptase translocation inhibitor, MK8591, in early phase development, although it's a bit too early at this stage to see exactly where that will be placed. Gilead, surprisingly, not too active in the pipeline, only a couple of agents, and they're both actually early phase agents. They have a TLR7 agonist and also a broadly neutralizing antibody approach, which they're hoping, when combined, might allow patients to have sustained off-treatment virologic responses. In other words, they're able to potentially stop antiretroviral treatment and yet not experience viral rebound. So that would be obviously a very important strategy in terms of reducing treatment costs if you could allow patients to stop treatment. And then just one final point that I wanted to point out on the right-hand side of the table there, you can see the HIV pipeline is dominated by small molecules, which is perhaps unsurprising given that the vast majority of currently approved antiretroviral regimens are small molecules. But there's also very significant interest in vaccines. So there are 12 candidates currently in development as identified by Biomedtracker. That's a mix of prophylactic approaches and also some therapeutic vaccine approaches. And those either aim to prevent initial infection, or they can also aim, in the case of therapeutic vaccines, to allow cessation of treatment by inducing some form of immune control over the virus, or potentially even better, although very much still in development, what would be the holy grail of R&D in HIV would be able to actually facilitate complete eradication of the virus. But we won't go into that now because it's still very early phase. But if I then just go on to the next slide and just focus now on the pre-registration and phase 3 candidates. So these are ones identified by, again, Biomedtracker here. I've already mentioned doravirine being developed as a low-cost regimen as part of a single-tablet regimen and also as a standalone agent. We also have Simchiza, which I mentioned, first ever protease inhibitor containing regimen. ViiV Healthcare, unsurprisingly very active in the pipeline. A couple of 2-drug regimens there, which we'll go on to a bit later on, that aim to reduce treatment costs. And in the case of the cabotegravir containing regimen, that's actually a long-acting injectable, which will be a first of its kind in the HIV market. Fostemsavir, another product acquired by ViiV Healthcare from Bristol Myers Squibb, that's being targeted at the salvage setting, so quite a niche setting there, and interesting. And also Cytidine is developing Pro-140, which is an antibody targeted against CCR5, which is a chemokine receptor that's required for viral entry into the cell. Again, that's also being targeted at the salvage setting, but also in quite an interesting turn, which seems very ambitious in my mind, also as a monotherapy maintenance agent for patients who are virologically suppressed. So certainly a very ambitious regimen and one to keep an eye on in future. But that's a quick summary of the late phase pipeline, Jay.
Thank you, Michael. With ViiV pretty much the leader in new HIV drug development, what are they prioritizing in their effort to gain market share on Gilead, Michael?
So ViiV's strategy, as I've mentioned, is primarily centered around simplifying treatment regimens to reduce the potential for side effects and also to lower treatment costs. So the first regimen, just to mention here, is Tivicay-Epivir. So that's in development for both treatment-naive patients and also as a switching regimen for patients who are virologically suppressed, i.e. patients who are a little bit easier to treat. And that could gain initial approval for that treatment-naive setting in the second half of 2019. So in terms of the differentiators of this regimen and its potential role in the treatment algorithm, it is effectively Triamec without abacavir. So as I mentioned, the abacavir component of Triamec is associated with safety concerns. So in recognition that actually the vast majority of physicians prefer Gilead's TAF backbone, or previously their TDF backbone, ViiV Healthcare here is trying to remove abacavir and see if they can improve the safety without compromising efficacy. However, that is a big caveat there, because some of the key opinion leaders we've spoken to can understand the potential toxicity benefit, but they're very worried about the potential for resistance generation and virologic failure if you reduce the number of drugs from 3 to 2, because for the last good 15 years or so, the standard of HIV treatment has been to use 3 antiretroviral agents. So this is certainly a very ambitious approach, and if you look at their phase 2 data, while they showed 90% virologic suppression in one of their phase 2 studies of, I believe it was around 120 patients, that virologic suppression rate is reasonably competitive, but there was a slightly worrying trend for increased risk of virologic failure in patients who had high baseline viral loads. So if you look at the overall data, I believe it was 4% virologic failure and 2% in those with low viral loads, so those with less than 100,000 copies. But for patients with more than 100,000 copies, it was an 8% virologic failure rate, which is certainly higher than is desirable. Now, of course, it's very small patient numbers. We need to wait and see when it comes to the phase 3 Gemini studies whether that actually is a trend that manifests. But certainly something that key opinion leaders are looking out for its phase 3 data. And then their second 2-drug regimen, which is actually approved already, called Gilead, and that is approved for use in virologically suppressed patients with no history of treatment failure. Now, again, that's approved in the US. It's currently in pre-registration in the EU, so it's still considered pipeline there. Again, their phase 2 data has been quite impressive so far. Sorry, their phase 3 data has been quite impressive so far, with 95% virologic suppression at week 48. So patients who swapped from their current regimen to Gilead and they maintained virologic suppression, which is always a promising sign. But again, really, I think these regimens, while potentially attractive, we really need to see long-term data regarding the risk of virologic breakthroughs. So the KOLs we've spoken to are really looking for good 3, 4, 5-year data before they're willing to adopt these wholesale. So there's going to be a slight delay, I think, in uptake of these regimens. Back to you, Joe.
Thank you, Michael. As you mentioned earlier, one of the newer development focuses in HIV is on long-acting injectable therapies, partially in hopes of increasing patient adherence to therapy. So what can you tell us about that, Michael?
Yeah, so this is quite an interesting regimen. Cabotegravir-rilpivirine, so it's a joint collaboration between ViiV Healthcare. Cabotegravir is an analogue of dolutegravir, so it's likely to have a very similar clinical profile. And then rilpivirine, as I've mentioned, Johnson & Johnson's NNRTI inhibitor, that is really needs to be repositioned in the future market. So this is quite interesting. The key opinion leaders we've spoken to think it would only apply to a minority of patients. They suggested somewhere in the range of 10 to 15% of their patients might be interested. But it could be particularly attractive for patients who struggle to adhere to once-daily pills, which is the current standard of care, or also patients who just don't want to be faced with that constant daily reminder of their HIV infection. So cabotegravir-rilpivirine is being developed in both a monthly and a bi-monthly dosing schedule. Obviously, bi-monthly potentially much more attractive because it would just allow 6 doses per year and allow people to forget about it once it's done. So potentially very attractive there. However, interestingly, one of the UK key opinion leaders we spoke to said he'd actually be quite hesitant to use it in poorly adherent patients, and that's because if a patient takes this drug, they inject it for the month and then they don't come back in the next month. Given that these drugs obviously have very long half-life to be dosed in such long intervals, there's going to be a very slow decay of their pharmacokinetic activity, and the virus will spend a good amount of time in the presence of subtherapeutic levels of drug, and that's potentially a big danger for driving treatment resistance, particularly given rilpivirine has low barrier to resistance. So there are conflicting views on its potential adherence advantage, but either way, certainly in institutionalized settings and also for incarcerated patients where you know exactly where they're going to be in the next month, clearly the adherence benefit is positive there. And then I believe there's just one final regimen I wanted to chat through with regards to Merck's future activities. So doravirine, as I've mentioned, is a novel NNRTI, or non-nucleoside reverse transcriptase inhibitor. So the company is developing this both as a standalone agent and also as part of a low-cost single-tablet regimen with lamivudine and TDF. So by itself, as a standalone agent, doravirine clinically is reasonably attractive. So it has quite a strong supporting data set so far. So, and certainly has a potential to challenge rilpivirine as the current preferred NNRTI. So to date, it's demonstrated non-inferior efficacy to efavirenz, but with improved CNS tolerability. So that pretty much puts it on par with rilpivirine that has done the same. But a key advantage for doravirine is that it doesn't have to be taken with food, whereas rilpivirine does. And it's also shown in the Drive Forward study, it's shown non-inferior efficacy to darunavir, which is the leading protease inhibitor, but without the undesirable effects on LDL-C, so cholesterol levels in the blood. So potentially, clinically, on the face of it, it seems quite attractive. However, I would say, again, in the US, the comparatives that we use in those trials are becoming increasingly less relevant because protease inhibitors and efavirenz in particular are no longer recommended. So that's going to be a key stumbling block for it in the US market. And then arguably more importantly, I think it's going to really struggle within the US market because of the lamivudine TDF backbone. So there's two issues of that. Firstly, lamivudine TDF doesn't have much supporting evidence behind it. It's not been studied in many clinical studies, and therefore it's unlikely to gain recommended status in treatment guidelines. And also the inclusion of TDF is becoming a bit of an anachronism now, given that the US market has had very rapid uptake of Gilead's TAF-based successor regimens, so it might be seen as a step back in the US market. It does, however, have better potential in the EU, partly because TAF has had mixed success in the EU markets, which we'll talk about later on. but also because NNRTIs and protease inhibitors are still relevant comparatives to be used in studies. So, and its lower cost nature, of course, will also be attractive in the EU, where payers tend to be more cost conservative. So I'll pass that to you, Joe. I believe you wanted to discuss some of the therapies in development in the salvage setting.
Yes, thanks, Michael. Another aspect of HIV treatment that we'll look at today is the salvage therapy setting. This is basically a niche market opportunity that some newer players may be using to try to gain a foothold in the HIV space. Notably, there's Thera Technologies, which got FDA approval on March 6th of its antibody drug Trogarzo for use in treating multi-drug resistant patients who are failing on their current antiretroviral regimen. We'll see how the market responds to this launch, which is slated for about 6 weeks after the approval, or any day now. Thera Technologies set an annual list price of $118,000 for the drug, although it expects rebates to drop its actual take here by about 30%. Cytodyne also has a monoclonal antibody targeting the salvage setting with its CCR5 targeted candidate Pro-140 in phase 3 for multi-drug resistant patients. The company announced last week that it will present phase 3 efficacy data for this drug in June at a conference, and we expect the BLA to be filed in the U.S. before the end of 2018. Earlier, we mentioned that ViiV acquired a pair of new mechanisms for oral HIV therapy in a deal with Bristol in late 2015. The more advanced of these is the attachment inhibitor fostemsavir, currently in phase 3 for multi-drug resistant patients. ViiV told Scrip that fostemsavir is being used in clinical trials as add-on therapy to antiretroviral therapy that isn't working quite as well for the individual patient as it once did. Like Trogarzo, this drug also targets the CD4 complex, and in phase 3, it has demonstrated statistical significance compared to placebo in reducing HIV-1 viral load. 54% of patients receiving fostemsavir, along with an optimized background therapy regimen, achieved viral suppression after 24 weeks of treatment, ViiV says. The company hopes to bring fostemsavir to market in 2020. While not a salvage regimen candidate, I'll just use this time to briefly review ViiV's other novel mechanism of action for oral therapy, which is the maturation inhibitor. It also acquired this program from Bristol in that 2015 deal and advanced its lead maturation inhibitor through phase 2B. But at that point determined that the drug, known as GSK 3532795, did not offer an optimal side effect profile. ViiV has 3 backup compounds, one of which has entered phase 1 development, while 2 others are in the preclinical stage. ViiV says it has not completely closed the door on 2795 and is exploring other delivery options as a way of possibly optimizing that molecule. But it seems to be that one of the follow-on candidates will emerge as a better option. Turning now to the market forecast and outlooks for various companies in the HIV space. Michael, I know you want to describe for us how the market currently is being driven by integrase strand transfer inhibitor regimen uptake. Looking past the pipeline, what is the market forecast and how will these companies compete? Michael?
Thanks, Joe. So I wanted to share some of the top-line trends from Datamonitor Healthcare's patient-based forecast. So this is for the US and the 5 EU once more, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and the UK. So what's presented here in this graph is the total sales across those markets for treatments rather than prophylaxis. So this excludes pre-exposure prophylaxis such as Truvada and in future Descovy. So we expect the market to grow to a peak of 22.7 billion in 2024 and then subsequently enter a protracted decline once the TAF patent expiry occurs. So that initial market growth for the next 8 or so years will be driven primarily by increasing uptake of the premium price integrase inhibitor regimens, so Biktarvy, Triumeq, and Tivicay, as we've mentioned previously, and also as well as increasing prevalence and prices in the US. So prevalence and price is not expected to have much of an impact in the 5 major EU markets because both of those factors are relatively flat. But in the US, prevalence, as we mentioned in the initial slide, is expected to rise. In terms of the integrase inhibitor-based regimen, so Biktarvy, as I mentioned, is expected to be a very successful regimen. It's going to be the main growth driver. It will do that by cannibalizing the share of Gilead's older integrase inhibitor-based regimens, but also by cannibalizing its NNRTI-based regimens, which are cheaper. So by cannibalizing the likes of a triplet, Odefsey, Complera, Gilead will be incrementally gaining revenues there, which will allow Biktarvy to reach 5.8 billion sales at peak in 2022. Of course, we're also expecting Gilead via Biktarvy to take patient share from Triumeq in the first-line setting, and also from Tivicay, which is often used as an add-on to Descovy or Truvada. So given that physicians could use Descovy plus Bictegravir as part of a single pill rather than having to use two separate pills if they wanted to prescribe Tivicay, that's also going to be a key driver of its uptake. So those are the key growth drivers, but of course it's not all a positive picture, as you can see towards the end of the forecast period. So there will be a few important resistors of growth that I'd also like to mention. So the first major growth resistor will be the launch of ViiV Healthcare's two-drug regimen. So assuming, of course, that they don't demonstrate higher rates of virologic failure or resistance generation issues in the long term, we do think that they could add to reduce treatment costs, not only by launching at reduced prices, but also necessitating further discounts of Gilead's regimens, as Gilead wants to try and maintain patient share. So that will be a big driver of, or a big growth resistor. Secondly, we're also expecting various third agents. So by third agent, I mean drugs that are not co-formulated with single tablet regimens but are still used in addition to usually a combination of two NRTIs. So you can see Reuters, Persista, Icentris, and Edgerant expected to lose patent expiration there. But the key driver will really be their patent expiration of TAF. And once that occurs, that's going to lead to significant payer pressure to break up fixed-dose combinations and single-tablet regimens to prescribe the cheaper generic backbone in combination with whatever the third agent is. And we're expecting that to have a very significant negative impact, particularly for Gilead. So those are the overall trends, Joe.
Thank you. So as you mentioned, one of the factors driving what's going on in the HIV market right now is Gilead's ongoing and so far successful effort to switch patients over from older combination drugs that comprise TDF, tenofovir disoproxil fumarate, to the newer prodrug called TAF, or tenofovir alafenamide. It's my understanding Gilead has enjoyed a lot of success in convincing physicians of TAF's better safety profile. Is that right, Michael?
Yes, that's certainly true in the US. So Gilead has been very, very successful in a very short time period of promoting swapping from TDF to TAF ahead of Truvada's patent expiry in September 2021 in the US. So they have had quite a large window of opportunity. The reason TAF has managed to achieve that uptake is partly because it's been priced comparatively to TDF, so it provides no disincentive to swap. There's no pricing issue there. And secondly, consistently across all of its empirical studies, not only in HIV but also in hepatitis B, TAF has shown reduced renal and bone toxicity as measured by surrogate markers. So surrogate markers being eGFR, so estimated glomerular filtration rate for renal function, and then for the bone toxicity profile, it's measured by bone mineral density changes. Also, in switching studies, they've shown that if patients who are on TDF swap to TAF, they do show subsequent improvements in these biomarkers, which is quite convincing data to support its improved renal and bone safety profile. However, I would say it's in the EU they've had much more mixed response. So it's quite interesting. In the key opinion leaders we've interviewed, you can see one of them from the UK there. The availability of generic TDF, so TAF's precursor in the EU, has introduced quite an interesting dynamic that isn't currently present in the US. And it's really split the opinions of key opinion leaders that we've spoken to on a US-EU axis. So some believe that TAF's surrogate marker benefits here justify its widespread use, while others believe that the benefits are only likely to be clinically significant and therefore justified in smaller groups of patients with pre-existing renal and bone conditions. And that's partly because it's very hard to say if actually these changes in these surrogate markers actually will lead to any reduction in real-world renal and bone adverse events. Now, to be fair to Gilead, it's not expected that they would have been able to show that yet, because the drug's only been on the market for 2 or 3 years now, just over 2 years, I think. And to show those real-world reductions will take a very long period of time. So it's very much based on inference at the moment that it would actually pay us money in the long term. But so the US respondents, given that they don't currently have that generic pressure from TDF, are quite happy to swap over. One of the key opinion leaders we spoke to said he thought it was cavalier with the patient's health not to. So you shouldn't take TDF's renal toxicity lightly, even though it is relatively small. Whereas if we look at the UK key opinion leaders that we've got here, UK respondents have been much more cost conservative, and that's understandable given that generic TDF has been available in the EU as of Q3 2017. And in fact, the UK Clinical Commissioning Guidelines actually suggest that TAF-based regimens should only be used if patients are ineligible for other options or they have pre-existing bone and renal conditions. So the UK payer is clearly very concerned that if a patient goes on to TAF, it's subsequently very hard to get them back off it onto TDF. So there's certainly been some reluctance in the UK to do that swapping. So just moving on to the next slide now, you can see here, even though there's reluctance in the EU, that's not going to prevent TAF-based regimens from achieving very high sales, driven largely by the US market. So you can see Biktarvy in the dark blue there, expected to be very successful with close to $6 billion in peak sales. The other TAF-based regimens, again, seeing varying levels of uptake depending on their positioning and guidelines. So you can see, for example, Odefsey not doing particularly well, remaining relatively flat and then declining because it's an NNRTI containing option, whereas Biktarvy, as you can see, dominating the market by far. So after 2024, you can also see these regimens starting to decline significantly. 2021 is when TAF is expected to expire in the EU, and 2025 in the US. And once that happens, as I mentioned, we are expecting a significant payer pressure to break up those single tablet regimens and prescribe generic variants of Descovy in addition to third agents. Whether those third agents will be integrase inhibitors or other cheaper options is yet to be seen, but that's certainly how we're picturing this dynamic developing in future, Joe.
Okay, now looking ahead over the next several years, what does Datamonitor Healthcare think the dynamics will look like among Gilead, ViiV, and the other companies keeping a hand in the HIV competition, Michael?
Yes, so as we've mentioned, and you can see on the graph here, Gilead clearly dominates the market currently. So, as I should say, these are treatment revenues rather than prophylaxis revenues. So it does exclude partly some of Truvada's sales. But we estimate that Gilead has approximately 50% market share in terms of sales. And as I mentioned earlier when I was discussing the treatment guidelines, that's largely because it has multiple single tablet regimens, and also it markets the preferred NRTI backbone. So clearly dominating at the moment. We're expecting the launch of Biktarvy to allow it to recoup market share. So you can see it continues to rise up until 2021. At that point, we also have the EU patent expiration of TAF, which will lead to significant declines in the EU markets across all of its regimens, which are based on that backbone. So it really is the trigger for Gilead. And then, of course, in 2025, when the US patent expires for TAF, that will have a much larger impact. So we're expecting Gilead's revenues to decline from then, and it will actually lose its market-leading position in terms of sales because of that, because Descovy and TAF is so pivotal to all of its single-tablet regimens that once that patent expires, it's going to be very hard for the company to maintain its revenues. Conversely, if we look at ViiV Healthcare, a more positive outlook here. So while in the short term, over the next 3 or 4 years, we're not expecting its market share to grow that significantly, we have forecast it to pick up certainly later on in the forecast period, and that's because of increasing acceptance of 2-drug regimens, we believe, if they are able to show good data with regards to lack of virologic breakthrough and no resistance generation. So the 2-drug regimens, and also continued uptake of Tivicay as the preferred integrase inhibitor, particularly in treatment-experienced patients, will be the key drivers of growth there for ViiV Healthcare. And then just finally, to briefly mention Johnson & Johnson and Merck. So Johnson & Johnson's market share is expected to remain relatively constant, so you can see in the orange there. So that company will experience headwinds from Darunavir's patent expiry in the coming years in both the US and the EU. But that is expected to be mostly offset by the launch of the 2-drug regimens. So Gilead obviously contains rilpivirine, and the cabotegravir rilpivirine long-acting injectable. So those 2 regimens will help to compensate for Darunavir's patent expiry in the long term. And then just finally for Merck & Co., we're expecting its sales share to decline, perhaps unsurprisingly, because Isentress is expected to continue to lose share to STRs, but also to Tivicay. And then also doravirine is not, for the reasons I previously mentioned, expected to be able to penetrate the US market particularly well. And so that will prevent that regimen compensating for Isentress's declines. And I believe that's it for market dynamics, Joe. So I'll just go on to the next slide. Just one final point I wanted to mention with regard to generics. So obviously generics are going to become a very important theme towards the end of the forecast period in particular. But not only then, you can see here just a list of products that are expected to lose patent expiry within the forecast period. So several major third agents are expected to lose patent protection, but also, as we've previously mentioned, generic Truvada in the EU is hampering TAF uptake, and also obviously when TAF patent expires, up to 40% of patients suggested by the survey respondents that I alluded to earlier are expected to be swapped from single tablet regimens to generic backbone plus a third agent. It's going to have a very significant impact on the market, and I think that pretty much summarizes the company dynamics, Joe.
Thanks, Michael. And of course, affecting those dynamics will be the anticipated increased role for generics, which is a prospect that might cause some sleepless nights at Gilead, I suspect. Right now, one of the generic mainstay companies, Mylan, is looking to gain market share in the U.S. with a set of combination pills that combine multiple agents that have gone generic but are not available in the United States as a single tablet regimen. This includes the 3-drug regimen Symphilo, which combines efavirenz, lamivudine, and TDF, as well as Symduo, a 2-drug regimen of lamivudine and TDF. It's somewhat questionable what kind of uptake these products will see in the U.S., considering that they contain TDF, given Gilead's success, at least in its home market, of convincing doctors about the safety benefits of TAF. And Michael, I know Datamonitor Healthcare has done some surveying of doctors who treat HIV patients. What do we know about how doctors view the potential and the impact of generics in HIV therapy, Mike?
Thanks, Joe. So, as I've mentioned, obviously we're expecting this payer pressure to break up FDCs and STRs, but it's not quite as simple as that in HIV, because that strategy, while it would save significant amounts of money, is certainly going to face resistance from physicians because of the potential negative adherence effect of that strategy. So increasing a patient's pill burden could lead them to be less compliant. And so the argument goes, particularly from Gilead, who obviously has quite a vested interest in this area, that it will risk, if patients are less adherent, then they might be less successful in terms of their virologic outcomes. So one of the key things we wanted to do at Datamonitor Healthcare was survey physicians and ask them how they feel about that balance, whether they're willing to compromise, what their views are on the adherence impact, etc. So again, these data that you're seeing here derive from that survey of 190 infectious disease specialists. And just to explain what you're seeing here, we effectively asked respondents, first of all, about the adherence impact, whether they thought it was significant or not. So they had 3 options. They could either believe that it was breaking up these FDCs and STRs will have a significant negative adherence impact, or that they believe it wouldn't have an impact, which is the light blue, or finally in the orange that they weren't sure, or they believed something else. So you can see if we start on the dark blue, respondents who have a more negative review clearly dominate. So across all markets, 61% of respondents believe that this strategy would result in a significant negative impact on their patients' adherence across all markets apart from the UK. Again, the UK an outlier here, and we suspect that's partly because of the cost pressures in the UK, which we'll come on to on the next slide, but also because if you actually look at the London Clinical Commissioning Guidelines, and a lot of our respondents were based in London, given there's a high HIV burden there, the clinical practice guidelines for London have actually recommended multi-pill regimens for several years now. So the preferred regimen is actually bacavir, lamivudine plus efavirenz, which is not only not recommended in EU guidelines, but it's also not a single tablet regimen. So that's potentially why these respondents in the UK were more willing to accept multi-pill regimens for their patients, and you can see the light blue bar there predominates. But then if we look at the flip side of the argument, so the negative adherence impact is obviously the downside of the argument, but from a payer standpoint, the cost savings are potentially massive, particularly when you consider over the lifetime of a patient. So the second question that we asked our respondents was whether they actually believe that the cost savings justified breaking up of FTCs, even if they did believe there was an adherence impact. So again, dark blue, respondents who are less keen on the strategy, they believe that the cost savings did not justify breaking up of generics. They don't believe it's worth the risk. Breaking up of single tablet regimens. The light blue bar there is respondents who believe that the savings did justify breaking up FTCs in select patients, so probably those with good adherence. And then the orange bar there is respondents who were quite happy to use generics widespread and obviously not that concerned with the adherence impact. So what's interesting here, back on the previous slide, we had 61% of people who took quite a firm stand against the idea of breaking up the STRs because of the adherence impact. But then if you look here in terms of the cost savings, only 39% believe that they weren't justified in that approach. So there's clearly a willingness to compromise here. If you look across all markets, that bar on the left-hand side, you can see actually the majority of respondents fall within that compromising category of that they would be willing to break up these single tablet regimens as long as it was in patients who they knew would be able to handle that extra pill burden. And interestingly, the UK, again, much more willing to perform this strategy, and again, that's likely because of cost concerns and also their increased experience. Now, I think the reason physicians are more likely to be willing to compromise when you consider cost is because actually, if you look at the data in the literature, there's very little, if any, data to suggest that moving from a once-daily single-tablet regimen to a multi-pill regimen, but where the pills are still given once daily, so going from 1 pill a day to maybe 3 pills a day that you take at the same time, there's no real evidence to suggest that that has a negative virologic suppression impact. Arguably, it could have a negative adherence impact, but if that doesn't translate into a reduction in real-world endpoints, then I think that's going to be very hard for physicians and also developers to argue the case for continued use of more expensive brands in this environment. So that pretty much summarizes our survey data, Jay.
Thanks. To wrap up, Michael and I would like to reiterate the 6 key takeaways that we perceive for the overall HIV market. First, Gilead currently dominates the market, but ViiV has multiple combo regimens in development that might help it take market share away from Gilead. Michael?
Thanks, Jay. So the second point we'd like to emphasize is that the increasing uptake of the premium price integrase inhibitor regimens, particularly Biktarvy and also Tivicay, which are expected to become the highest selling brands in the market, will drive future short-term market growth. Joe?
So third, Gilead's TAF-based regimens are experiencing strong uptake in the U.S., and that should continue, but uptake in the 5 largest EU markets will be constrained by the availability of generic TDF and fixed tablet combinations. Michael?
Yep, and then ViiV Healthcare's 2 drug regimens will add to lower treatment costs, but their uptake, as we've mentioned, and as KOLs have supported, is going to be very highly dependent on them being able to demonstrate competitive rates of virologic suppression in the long term with minimal rates of virologic breakthrough and also resistance generation over prolonged periods of time. Joe?
Gilead's TAF faces patent expiries in 2021 in Europe, 2025 in the U.S. That likely will trigger market decline, both overall and for Gilead. Michael?
And finally, as we've just discussed, generics are expected to heap significant pressure on physicians to break up branded single tablet regimens and also fixed dose combinations. As we know, we are expecting some resistance from physicians there with regard to adherence impact, but we expect in the long term the cost savings are likely to outweigh that for a significant minority of patients.
Thank you. That brings us to the end of today's presentation. I'm sorry we don't have time to take questions live, but please remember that you can send questions to pharma@informa.com. And remember also, please, that this is being recorded. Everyone listening will receive a copy of the recording, and this webinar will be available on demand. That concludes our presentation for today. Thank you.